It's like somebody that I was telling recently about what makes a good Nigerian story. And many people often think that, oh, I want to talk about, Boko Haram, I want to do, and I'm like, sometimes what we just need is maybe a really brilliant story about plantain. And I've said this many times because I've not seen somebody do that. Just help us understand plantain.
This episode is proudly supported by Orca.
And the episode would not be possible without your support. So kindly like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at the Lost in Lagos podcast.
Thank you.
There's a version of Nigeria that exists in real life, and then there's a version we tell stories about. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't even recognize each other. We are living in a moment where Nigerian culture is being documented more than ever before in essays and films and podcasts and perfectly curated Instagram grids.
But the question is, what exactly are we capturing? Is this an honest archive of who we are, or a carefully edited highlight reel of who we would like to be? And more importantly, who gets to decide?
In this conversation, we're exploring culture not just as something we consume, but as something we interpret, shape, and sometimes misrepresent. From how Nigeria is seen globally to how Gen Z is redefining storytelling in real time.
Today's guest is one of those people who makes you slightly more careful about your opinions, because you just know he's already thought about them 10 steps ahead.
Wale Lawal is Oxford educated, Harvard trained, Forbes 30 under 30, and sometimes, despite all of that, still chose Lagos as the place to be. Founder and editor-in-chief of The Republic, he's been shaping how Nigeria thinks about itself. Politics, culture, identity, power, nothing is off the limit, but everything is deeply considered.
Some people document culture, some people critique it. He does both. Welcome, Wale.
Thank you for having me.
So I'll just get right into it, yeah? I want to start off by saying I love how you document Nigeria and Africa so delicately. Mm-hmm. And I know the Republic Journal has many layers, but I think one of my favorite layers is how fine you've made African education and literature, right? And also the exposure. I saw the work they're doing with Little Republic, exposing like this fine literature and education, African education to like the younger generation. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important to have them get exposed to such fine detail early on. And in this finesse, and I say this with a little bit fanboying here and with grandeur. So this finesse and grandeur that is in the work is so much translated into your personal life. Like even your page, if you go on your page, you're just like, this is so put together, it's so curated. So I guess my question is, where did all of this like come from? Yeah.
That's a good question. And I don't know how much time we have, but it's a very long story. So I grew up reading The Economist. I studied economics in university, but I already was reading The Economist in high school, in secondary school here. And I remember that I just found it very foundational to how I was experiencing the world. And when I moved, I left Nigeria to finish schooling in the UK. And when I moved, I remember that my school had, I still am, I was a big nerd, very, very into not just books, but also just magazines, just trying to really understand, especially when it was like intellectual magazines. And I remember my school had this wide like array of magazines from different parts of the world. They had, the usual American magazines. And when it came to Europe, I remember they had like, like Le Monde newspaper, they had like Der Spiegel, they had different publications that spoke to those regions, like outlooks on the world. And I remember just thinking, okay, there's nothing here from, from Nigeria, or there's nothing here from just where I'm from. And one thing I'm always fond of saying is that media in Nigeria is actually very advanced in terms of how far it can go and how far it has been going. Quality might be a bit patchy in some places, but the infrastructure is there largely. To the extent that like if I'm somewhere and there's like global magazines, it's kind of odd that there's no, because when I know that obviously in Nigeria we have tons of magazines and just tons of like, people writing about different things. But I think the big push really came in, so all of that was happening in my background, right? But then the big push really came in around the 2010s to 2013, when we had that Africa Rising moment. And as somebody who had been growing up reading The Economist, I remember like very early on in my like childhood, there was this big idea of Africa as the hopeless continent. In fact, The Economist had a cover called Africa, the Hopeless Continent in like 1999, 2000. And then by 2011, it had become Africa Rising. So this paradigm that we all kind of latched onto, this Africa Rising paradigm, was basically made up by people in a newsroom. And I found that so fascinating. It was made up by people in a newsroom that were so far away from the continent and were kind of determining the trajectory and the view that the world had.
Rather than it coming from
rather than
here.
it coming from, you know, from the inside. And what also fascinated me was not just that, you know, international people or global people latched onto that. It was also that we latched onto it as well. And it just kind of made me think, okay, so we were called like hopeless continents.
Now we're rising.
We took that as well. Now we're rising. Obviously, we took that for good, you know, for good reasons. And at that time, I remember, you know, McKinsey had the report Lions on the Move. We had like a lot of countries rebasing their economy. So I studied economics. I was very interested in just what was going on. But the challenge I had with economics at the time was it was very difficult for me to understand how these economic theories and policies were actually playing out in real life. So I was learning things in school, you know, but I wasn't really seeing them followed or practiced in the way that I was being taught in school. So it made me understand that there was a kind of like
Disconnect.
gap or disconnect in what I kind of understood about how countries like mine should operate and how they actually did operate. So rebasing was one of them. Nigeria went from about $250 billion on paper to over 500, right? And for me, it was like, this thing is happening overnight. And that was a commentary that people were having, but we don't feel any richer. And rebasing is a very interesting thing because it was like, okay, we were using the wrong metrics to actually study the size of our economy. We were not factoring things like technology, we were not factoring things like Nollywood. And so suddenly they changed the metrics and the economy was bigger, but the people did not feel richer. And what that basically was showing me was even when the stories were positive, it wasn't really real. So we were kind of caught between two extremes. It's either you're having extremely negative stories that we know are not necessarily the full picture, or extremely positive stories that we know are also not the full picture. And it's of course no surprise now that, you know, the whole Africa Rising thing has died down. People are a lot more cynical these days as well. But in that moment, for me, it was like, okay, I don't really understand what is going on the continent. I can't really figure this out. So as a student, one of the things that I was very interested in was, okay, how can we get the people who know this continent really well to actually tell us what is going on and to actually just inform us about what is going on? So the Republic started as a student journal. That's why we have that tagline that we're now trying to, like, you know, evolve out of. So a lot of people call us the Republic Journal. We're now trying to take up the journal part and just become the Republic. But we started as a student journal. I created it in, like, you know, a dorm room in university. And the whole goal then was to just bring African experts to talk about just what is happening on the continent, to give expert commentary.
I'm so proud of us.
Beyond proud.
We're the best podcast ever.
The best. And Lagos is going crazy for our work, by the way.
I mean, that deserves a toast.
To being the best hosts
Hostess
in the business
ever.
of lifestyle.
Like the greatest. You're so
Excuse
good.
me, ma. Excuse me, ma.
Again?
This guy again.
Ma, how many times do I have to tell you, you can't be here?
But why?
This is an Okamo showroom.
And
Oh my God. Security.
Elvis, grab the wine. Let's
No,
go.
no, no, this way.
Oh, you.
All of that changed in 2020 when we had NSAS, right? And during NSAS, there was a kind of like informal media blockade. People were not really talking about it. Traditional media was not really talking about it. And I remember we got this push from our audience that you guys have always talked about critical issues. You should go to the streets and speak to people. And it's like, that's not what we do. We're more about just like analyzing and figuring things out in a kind of like, you know, bigger picture way. But spur of the moment, we started platforming like activist voices. We were speaking to everyday people, featuring journalists. And then we realized that, oh, okay, this is the kind of journalism that we can do. We can actually bring the kind of rigor that we've learned in academia to journalism without it being very slow, because academic rigor is always very slow and academic publications tend to come out very slowly. We could also really bring in the kind of like credibility that we had seen in international press.
First hand.
So if you remember, it was during COVID as well. So there were not many international newsrooms that could fly in, that could really cover it. So we had to literally be on the ground, and we had to do this, you know, to the extent of just like best practice. But we could also be locally relevant, not just featuring stories about Lagos, going to other parts of Nigeria, figuring out just what this this country really means to people outside of like the actual hubs, right? And then the final thing was it had to also be really engaging, because we're in a social media era. That's where you now start to see the things around the aesthetics, you start to see the things around branding, and that is very deliberate, because one of the things that we're always saying is people don't want stories for just story's sake these days. They don't just want journalism for journalism's sake. They want to experience it. They want to internalize it. They want to kind of use it as a form of making their own identity. And it's not necessarily a new thing. And I always use the comparison of you can really tell two different people apart based on just what kinds of foreign magazines or foreign publications they read. Someone who reads The Economist is so different to somebody who reads the FT.
Yeah.
And they're from the same, city, from the same country, and then you can now even like scale that up to look at somebody who's reading The Atlantic, The New Yorker. And the big question we had for ourselves is, okay, when we see people reading African publications, when we see people reading Nigerian publications, does that really signal or trigger anything about their identity to us? And we were very interested in seeing how you could kind of build journalism, build storytelling into an actual identity marker. So if I'm holding the Republic, does that signal me as a progressive person?
What does a Republic reader look like? Actually,
That's a good question. So for us, what we were always trying to do was to figure out how we could project readers who were curious. We could project readers who were progressive in ideals, because it's very important that we really understand that the ways in which our societies are set up, there are so many people that are left out of the room.
Yeah.
There are so many people that are marginalized,
Yeah.
and it's very important to not just be aware, but to also just amplify those realities. So we wanted people, or to signal to people that cared about those types of issues. We were also very interested in independent thinking. And independent thinking is a very, very tricky one, because it even means like independent thinking that we may not necessarily agree with. So there's times when we publish things for the sake of just provoking debate, provoking dialogue. And I think that for us, we were very interested in readers who are equally excited about being inspired, but also about being challenged. Like, what do we really know, and how are we really sure that what we know is accurate, is authentic?
And do you feel like the readers today are doing that, are challenging you, are asking the right questions? Like, is there a demand for that?
Absolutely. And I think that if we even go back to like the NSAS story, that was a challenge.
Yeah.
We didn't think that we were set up to actually run stories and series about just NSAS going into the streets, interacting with protesters. That's not what we were like set up to do. But they basically told us that if this is your mission, and your mission is to represent Nigerians
get
in
on
the best
the
light,
streets.
then get on the streets and speak to people. So they challenge us in that way. But also there's a lot of challenges that come in terms of just even like, because we're also very big on how ideologies work. So for example, whether it's, feminism, whether it's even just like post-colonial realities, and just really trying to understand some of those ideas, they also challenge us on those fronts. How are we reporting on certain stories? What picture did we even use? And it's very interesting because, and I always say this, that I'm very nitpicky about these types of things. I think all editors have to be. But it's also very interesting, serving an audience that's just as nitpicky as that.
Yeah.
Right.
The moment that you put a picture that is not necessarily aligned with what you're trying to do,
They'll
they're calling it
interrogate,
out.
yeah.
The moment something is phrased in a particular way, they're calling it out. The moment, let's say, you're referring to something as a conflict as opposed to like, maybe a war or oppression, they're calling it out.
And that makes you like
It's
much
accountable.
more
Yeah.
accountable, yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's the difference.
Less
between-
complacent.
That's
right?
the difference in our model, right? Because the model for us was that advertising was going to be very difficult from the beginning because it was a small publication. So let's generate reader revenue directly. Let's actually have subscribers, people who are paying to read this journalism. And what that did for us is it made them even more invested in what we were doing. So you'd have people telling you that, no, I don't, subscribe to this so that you guys can do this or can do that. And it is very important because we also live in a market where, because of the over-dependence on advertising, and because much of that advertising comes from the government, comes from big corporations, it's very easy for everyday people to feel like they're left out of the stories that they're reading, or
Right.
that the stories or the publications that they're reading are not accountable to them. So for us, again, being a smaller publication, and also just being very close with our readers, we could not escape accountability. We had to be accountable from day one.
No, I think that's great. And it really does make it more genuine, the content, because it's that it's being put out there for the sake of knowledge, for absorbing that information to the fullest extent.
So I have a question on documentation still.
Sure.
Do you think that, okay, but before I get to that documentation part, even with the work that the Republic is doing, documenting Nigerian lives, African lives, do you think as a continent, as a people, that we're even interested in doing it better ourselves?
Absolutely. And you know, when we have these, and we have these debates many times in the media ecosystem, where it's like, oh, people are only interested in short form content. You know, the media ecosystem is changing. There's no more room for long form. I always disagree with that. I actually think the future of media is quality and depth. And what I've experienced with Nigerians, what I've experienced with African audiences, is that number one, we are already underserved. So for example, when people tell me that, oh, you know, print is done, it's saturated, and I'm always like, relative to what? If you were telling me this in America, I would understand, because yes, they've had centuries of, you know, uninterrupted, you know, print
Like
publications that were
yeah.
critical, that were all of those things. But here, you know, we had an era of print, but then obviously military rule, you know, just this kind of like crackdown on the public sphere, on the
But it
public
still didn't
thinking
go
sphere,
around.
you know, made it kind of just disrupted that entire flow. So we never really had access to just really great thinking or really great storytelling about us.
Ourselves, yeah.
That has never really been a systematic thing in that way, because it was always disrupted by the different military regimes, by the different just issues, you know, economic uncertainty, all of those things. And at a point in developing the Republic, I was always fond of saying, if I wanted to read, you know, on Donald Trump's foreign policy, there's 1,000 publications that I can read on that. If today I want to read on, you know, Tinubu's foreign policy, and it doesn't mean that the foreign policy doesn't exist. It does, but who has actually put it
Who's
together?
documenting
Who's
it?
documented it? All of those types of things. So we can't, for me, what I've realized is that there's so much work that needs to be done. And that excites me actually, because it means there's work to do.
Exactly.
At least you have a job to do in that
yeah.
kind of sense. And we're barely scratching the surface. And the other thing that excites me is that when the work is done really well, the audiences are interested. I think that it's very tricky in the environment that we're in right now, because my own kind of pet theory on Nigerians is that we're in the post-Africa Rising era, we're in the post-NSAS era, where people are a lot more cynical, where there's this, in the spectrum between like hope and despair, people are leaning more towards despair. And that's an interesting space to be in, because it doesn't necessarily mean that people have given up, but sometimes it also means that the premium that people will place on you being able to tell them something compelling about their realities, whether it is positive or negative, is a lot higher.
Yeah.
What I've realized with African audiences is that we don't want people or need people telling us that, oh, the Africa they don't show you. We don't want people glossing over the realities, because we know that these realities are very tough. Like I'm always saying that for anyone to reckon with just like whether it's African history or African just realities, you're going to have to reckon with a lot of really just
Difficult,
brutal, brutal
but
livelihoods.
that's, I mean, you could say
But that
the
is-
same for any country, right?
Exactly.
I mean, America's history isn't exactly
It's not
clean
exactly
and
pristine.
pretty, yeah.
But I think that with us, you know, there's always been this idea of, you know, we've been, I guess, marginalized historically, we've been misrepresented historically, and so there's this urge to overcorrect, right? But I'm finding that increasingly people are understanding the dangers of doing that, and we're now chasing just the reality. You know, truth is subjective. Just show me the reality. Let me understand how, okay, this thing has happened that is so great for us, but maybe not everybody feels like it is great. I think people are very interested in that, because that is the reality that we face. We live in environments where extreme wealth lives side by side, and
Extreme
sometimes
poverty,
even,
yeah.
and Nigeria in particular, because I was making this comparison with South Africa to someone a couple of days ago, where I said, you know, in places of South Africa, it is still, and that's a legacy of apartheid, right? It's still very stratified. Like wealthy people live very different realities, very, very markedly different realities from the non-wealthy people. But in Nigeria, it's very different in the sense that you're only maybe like 1-2 people removed from poverty. Oftentimes, you're living entrenched in it. Like even the most expensive neighborhoods cannot escape, you know, the surrounding inequality around us. And I think that for me, that means that the stories that we tell cannot be pristine, you know, because that's not our reality. Our reality isn't a reality where it's a utopia where you've kind of locked people out. It's not a Dubai, as much as, we're always trying to see how we can build
Paint
the
the
next
picture.
Dubai,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's not. And I think there's something very interesting about that as well, where you have to really reckon with this idea that you live in a society where the wealthy people actually have a good sense of how the non-wealthy people live, but also where the non-wealthy people have a very good sense of how the wealthy people live. And I don't think that there are many environments like that. And for us, as media makers and audiences, that is very exciting. It's a very, that kind of perspective of we can be, it's not really neutral, but you can just paint the reality as it is. And I think that people really appreciate that increasingly these days, because we've tried the whole, the Africa they don't show you, and we've tried, let's be excited about GDP rebasing, let's be excited about all of these things, and we've realized that the consequence of that is that, it fades away, and then you're still back to, where you were before, and sometimes even maybe you've regressed, So I think people these days just want the truth. They just want, or not even just the truth, they just want the reality. And so long as it's presented to them in a way that takes them seriously, in a way that doesn't dumb it down, I think that there's a big interest.
But there's also that question of who are you telling the stories for?
Absolutely.
Is it the future generation? Actually, who are your readers? Like in terms of age, generations, like who are you directing this content to, and how are the Gen Zs now going to absorb this information and then and be able to document it themselves through their channels? I mean, their channels, like we can't be on, TikTok and everything, but through, because my kids will soon be, sharing those stories. And so how do you see the Gen Z kind of taking this information and telling it in their own voice?
Absolutely. I think for us, we think about our audiences in different kind of categories, and those are kind of tied to the platforms that we use. So, for example, the print magazine is primarily for the much older audience. It's a very kind of, we've kind of understood over time that the kind of person it attracts is somebody who's very busy, who often is a business leader or organization leader, and they read it to kind of just like slow down and really immerse themselves, or they read it or they build collections of it for like their home. So it's a very kind of mature audience type of, and so you're looking at people over the age of, usually people who buy the magazines are usually over the ages of like 30, and up. For online though, it's also further broken down, right? So there's our website, which tends to attract a lot of young professionals, particularly young professionals who work in research, who handle, who work in consulting jobs, where they have to travel, where they have to understand the continent, and where they not just have to understand the continent, but they have to form a perspective about what is going on. And so this also applies to journalists. We have like a lot of readers who actually are journalists as well, both local journalists and international journalists. But when it comes to our core readers, these are usually young African professionals who are incredibly mobile. They are working in Nigeria today. Tomorrow they move to Chicago. But they still want to kind of understand and form a perspective on the world that is, African, that is rooted in our continent, but also that really understands what is going on in our continent. Increasingly, we've been doing a lot of work with podcasts, right? And that is incredibly popular with Gen Z people, or Gen Z, audiences. And that is a bit of a surprise to me because I'm not Gen Z, right? But I'm there, we're making this podcast. We've kind of loaded it with a lot of research. It actually feels like a documentary. It's a narrative podcast, so it's very like, it has to be well written, well produced. There has to be a narrative arc. We have to really think about the storytelling as well. And although it's always about maybe 7 or 8 episodes, it takes us a year to produce. But we get the strongest feedback from young audiences being like, I didn't have time to read. Or not even I didn't have time to read. That's actually not correct. It's I didn't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And so, because one of the things that we also do in the podcast is we're very big on referencing. So we'll talk about the books that have helped us to understand this issue, or we will talk about a book as part of the storytelling. And so people start to really build reading lists to understand what is going on. One thing I've understood about Gen Z audiences is the fact that there's a hunger to know more, but then there's the challenge of not knowing where to start. There's a challenge of over-information, and there's a need for kind of some sort of like curation, direction, and that just makes it that just gives them like a clearer path towards understanding what is going on. Imagine that you're living in an environment where And I think older people or older audiences are fond of saying that how can you not know what is going on in a time where you have so much access to information? But that is a problem as well.
A problem.
It's almost like it's almost like you entering a room that's just full of books and somebody's telling you, okay, start. Okay, but where do I start? Like, what's the theme? What's the story? Why should I focus on this book? What do I need to know about this? So there's a lot of like context that's often missing. And I think that when it comes to African stories, or when it comes to just even African history or African media, I think that we take context for granted. We just assume that people know what is going on. And there's no like, okay, let's take a step back, that if you are actually learning about Nigeria for the first time, here's what you need to know. And I'm often fond of saying this, that this happens a lot, and we will see it happen again during elections, when everybody just pretends to know exactly what is going on, to know how the election works, everything. And I mean, I'm fond of saying, I actually don't. The thing is, I've studied Nigeria for such a long time, and I do not know how this country works.
It's if you understand.
And you know what I mean? And I feel like if you understand this country, then you may be a part of the problem, because I just feel like, but I think on a more serious note, I also even from my own experience and from my own understanding, I've met people in government positions who also don't know how this country works. And not because of
fake
like
it till you make it
but,
kind of thing.
But also, and sometimes it's not even just because of a lack of ignorance. It's also just because the accessibility, the pathway to understanding what is going on is not really clear.
It's not clear.
Like, and I think for us, we're having this conversation in Lagos, right? And for me, there's a big question I'm always having, which is, for all of us in Lagos, which can often feel like a bubble, how do we know, or how much do we know about what's happening elsewhere? And I think that we are in this position where people are more comfortable pretending like they know what is going on, as opposed to like approaching it with curiosity. Like, it's actually, it's not a bad thing to not know what is going on. And I think that that's one thing I've learned from Gen Z audiences. There is an honesty about it, that actually we are in our 20s, we still don't know what is going on. And that is why it is important that we do. We're talking about big national issues where there is still no established facts. Big national issues like the Civil War, even big national issues these days, or most recently like NSAS, really trying to understand, but what's the actual agreed fact? Because we also live in an environment where someone can say this is what happened, another person can say, actually, no, this is what happened. And then we're all kind of torn between, but what is the actual reality? And I think we've been playing that game for a long time, and other generations have been very comfortable with pretending like, okay, let's just assume that, there's a reality there, or let's just pick one side because of tribe or because of just like different political advantages. Whereas you have the younger audience who is like, no, we've been trying the same methods. It doesn't make any sense.
They call you out on it.
And they call you out, right? But I also feel like one thing I really appreciate about these audiences is that it's not just a thing of calling people out alone. There's not just that projection. There's also that internal work of, we actually don't really understand what is happening. And there's that desire to, there's that hunger too as well. And so things like podcasts, and why podcasts? Because it's very friendly. It's very audience friendly. It's very immersive. Some of the comments that we've gotten are, well, it's a good thing to listen to while I'm in transit. It's a good thing to listen to while I'm doing other things. But also there's a way in which you can kind of make audio work, and I'm sure you guys know this already, that just kind of excites people in a way that maybe text cannot, right? And so for us, what is exciting us at the moment is trying to think about how we can not necessarily dump all the work that we've been doing with text, but start to see how we can kind of make them work together, right? So weaving them together, which is why, for example, when you buy the magazine, we use a lot of QR codes. You can listen to stories through the QR codes. You can watch segments that we've also included in that story online through the QR codes as well. It's all in this effort of really trying to understand, just that immersion, and really just trying to shift from journalism being this, this practice of giving people information as opposed to actually shaping their experiences. So we're very big on experiences, and I think that that's also because younger audiences today are big on experiences. The final thing that I will say is that I was on this Gen Z audiences thing, because it's still something that I'm still thinking about, and that our team is still thinking about. I was in a panel once a couple of years ago where, we're again just talking about how do you get young people listening to the news. Young people are turning away from the news. There's a crisis there. How do you get young people? And I remember one of the panelists made such a powerful point, which was that there was a newsroom in Latin America that was grappling with the same issue. And I think they had hired like an intern or just, somebody that was working with them. And the intern was like, yeah, we're not listening to the news because the people who tell us the news are older people. Nobody wants to listen to older people. And so they tried this experiment where they literally got young people, like Gen Z age people, to broadcast the news. And that was a big difference because I think, and I say that because that's still something that we don't do in Nigeria, where the news feels like it's very top down, it's very authority figure, like telling you what is going on. It's very much the older generation telling you what is going on. That is, if you are a member of the Gen Z audience. And I'm always wondering what it would look like if you were talking about the serious issues that Nigeria deals with, but it was coming through, just people that you feel like you have more in common with. And of course, it still follows like the journalistic practices. It's still there's still a lot of research that happens. In fact, the research might be handled by people of other generations, but how it is presented to that audience is also very important. And so that's why, like, when you listen to, like, for example, season 1 of our podcast, we used a lot of memes. So many different memes, so many different, like, pop culture references. At some point we're talking about, Kim Kardashian in there, in a story about elections, right? So I think for me, it's a very exciting thing that happens when you start to think about how can you make Nigerian stories more accessible to younger audiences, because it literally disrupts everything that we know about what Nigerian stories can be.
For sure.
So I want to veer off the conversation a little.
Sure.
But I just want to like acknowledge what you said. I think you're right on the money with Gen Z's us. I'm going to acknowledge that to be the Gen Z in the sitting. Not really having a clue about a lot of things. And I think it's affecting like different parts of our lives. And I will give an example. Right now, in the way documentation is done in real time, there's a bit of rawness, even with Twitter, TikTok. People there's no depth, if you understand what I mean. So with like rawness and depth. And you mentioned how basically young people are trying to now do things together, and it's giving rise to a lot of community-led or focused initiatives. So, and that's where we're looking towards. So now this is the place I'm veering you off to. So in recent times, we've seen that when things start, like there's hype around a certain project or business or just initiative or anything, that after a while, after the hype it goes up, then if there is no like depth or trust is not there as built as an infrastructure or something, that after a while it just dies out. And it's happening a lot in Lagos that as much as we don't know where we are going to, living in Lagos in this bubble is getting more shallow and shallow and shallow, that we can't even build depth. So I don't know if you would like to like speak on that.
That is it's actually something that I think about very often. And sometimes I worry about sounding too old when I think about that. But I think one of the things that, and I speak as somebody who I guess is very big on social media and kind of, at least for a very long time, was very active on the platform. I think one of the consequences of it was that we normalized what it meant to seek instant gratification in a world where the most transformative thinking, the most transformative impact takes time. I find that, like, as young people, and this time I'm even referencing myself, we can be very, very impatient with the kind of progress that we're looking for, with the improvements that we're looking for. And I understand it because, when you've lived in a country that has been dysfunctional all your life, there's a way in which you either just accept it and just become complacent, or you just feel like you want change now. And I find that, again, we're often caught between those two extremes. How does that manifest in the way that we work and in the context of the media? What it means is this big interest in just chasing virality over substance. You have a lot of people who set up things or who become influencers or who become, or who follow a path where the rewards are immediate. You can spread what kind of information, you can do something that's clickbaity, and you will get like that kind of visibility. but the longevity of that work
Yeah.
is not guaranteed. The impact of that work is never guaranteed. One thing that I always, come back to is this idea that we really need to start to be more interested, not just in how flashy things can look. And I say this about the media because the media is an industry that can look very glamorous. But the real work that goes into good media, the real work that goes into, much of that work is not glamorous. It is it is like grunt work. I say this as somebody who used to, for some time, I used to write scripts for Nigerian television. And I remember that we would work with different writers, and we had a head writer at the time who was very fond of saying, we are spending 3 months producing something that people are going to consume in 30 minutes. And I remember back then there was a kind of I think we've had a shift where in the past, when you told somebody that you're producing something like that, they're immediately thinking about the 3 months that you need to produce to get to 30 minutes. Whereas now, we're only just thinking about the 30 minutes. We want it now, without thinking about the level of work that goes into it. And I also find that, another thing that I've also kind of experienced in Nigeria, especially when you're doing good work. So, whether it's in how, for example, the Republic magazine looks or how, the aesthetics are laid out, I find that when you are doing good work or when you are doing serious work, there's a chance of Nigerians thinking that it's very easy.
Yeah.
And for me, I have a rule, which is that if it looks like it's difficult, then you're not working hard enough. It has to look easy so that it's seamless, so that it doesn't there's no, it's almost like, a dress, right? The best, you don't see the
sewing that goes
you don't see
into
all of that. It
yeah.
just looks very neat. So now just imagine that, okay, because it looks very neat, you're just assuming that
must
someone's
be
just
easy.
I can do this.
photocopying the dress and it's coming out. And I think that that's the way that we've kind of approached so many
Media.
things. And my worry is that with social media, with the media industry right now, we keep on just focusing on that part of the work as opposed to the actual real technique, the actual real work. You meet people who want to produce podcasts, who want to do really exciting things, and then they find it very difficult to believe that a podcast that you're only going to have 7 episodes can take you a year to produce. And so what happens instead is, okay, well, I'm just going to open my TikTok and just start, based on just what I've read. But the thing is, there's a reason why these things happen. And for us, much of that work isn't even, and I'll say this as well, that much of that work isn't even just in doing research and trying to write that, and that's why it takes a year. It's also getting all the legal permissions. It's getting all the releases signed. It's getting all the consent forms. And so when you take all of those processes out, what we then end up having is a very unhealthy media system where people feel like their work has been stolen, undervalued, or not properly actually produced. Sure. And so I worry that that is kind of where we're veering into. And I think for me, one of the biggest areas that we also see this is, we've worked with a number of people who wanted to write in the magazine, and the editorial process is very rigorous. And I think sometimes when people encounter the rigorous nature of it, because you're pushing back, you're fact checking, is this real? Can you actually say this? How do you know this? They just vex and they're like, well, I mean, I can just go on my Substack and post it. And then it's like, okay, actually, go and post it there. But the reason
they don't
why...
understand why you're asking those questions.
And you're asking those questions not because obviously for a big reason, I want to make the story good. But I don't want a lawsuit.
You want to be held accountable for every word you put out there.
So, that accountability has to be baked into every single layer, because the moment something escapes in that kind of sense, you can get sued. Or you can get sued, or you can get into serious trouble, and I think that and again, it doesn't help to build a healthy media ecosystem or a healthy public, sphere. So I worry about that sometimes. Sometimes I understand why we have to be impatient. I understand where that impatience comes from. But I also feel like you cannot rush good work. You have to take the time.
I know you also do a lot of work with universities or even, I don't know if they're universities, but people who are interested in learning journalism and through symposiums. Is that something you're teaching them? Because I think it's such a valuable lesson, and especially to the younger generation, that research and that care in your work it is so important in the quality of the work that comes out. Is that something that is being taught, and
Absolutely.
how are people responding to it?
You know, the funny thing is, and I think this is what excites me, I think many people respond to it with a, oh, okay, I understand. And, you know, for me, that is a very refreshing take because, again, I think because of the way our media ecosystem has been structured, because of all the disruptions that have gone in place, we just didn't have the chance to institutionalize certain practices. And so oftentimes when you meet people, and we've had workshops, we've done, you know, different kinds of workshops, oftentimes, you know, one thing that excites me about them is that the people I meet are often learning about these things for the first time.
Wow. Isn't that scary?
It is. It's scary, but it's not surprising because I can understand why and how we've come to this point. It's scary for me because in the sense that, and I get what you mean, in the sense that obviously with a workshop, you're only picking a subset of people, which means the larger
There's
set
a
of people.
huge number of people who
just
have
do
no
not-
idea.
Absolutely. It's scary in that way. But I think that for me, what makes it exciting is that the moment people are exposed to, okay, but this is the best practice. This is best practice. I've never actually gotten pushback in that kind of format. Maybe it's because it was in a workshop as opposed to, like, you know, you're working on a piece and there's a deadline that we're chasing and everybody's like really frantic. But I find that people really want to do good work. And so when they know what good work looks like, they're more willing, and and when they know what it looks like, and when there's that kind of care that has been taken to explain why this is good work, I think people are more receptive. The challenge that we have is that we're not seeing enough examples of good work.
And do you
We don't
think
have
that
enough
there's a
references.
problem in the system, like
Absolutely.
the universities, like
I
where
think
is the break?
I think universities have a very interesting challenge. And I remember I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a professor, and she spent a lot of time between South Africa and the UK. She's been a professor in both environments and in the US. And it's not just a Nigerian problem. I think there's a general sense in which universities stopped being the places where the most exciting thinking is happening a long time ago.
That's
It
sad.
used to be that universities were, you know, spaces for people to just test ideas, be innovative with ideas. Well, you know, universities are facing their own challenges. We live in a time where universities no longer have this kind of endless amount of resources. We live in a time where universities, and many of them have to answer to like private donors, to stakeholders, governments, people who are giving them. There's now this kind of like funding orientation around the universities that really puts a limit on what can be done. When we bring it to Nigeria in particular, you've had a situation where there have been decades of just the crippling of universities. Whether it was through structural adjustment programs in the 80s that just limited the amount of funds that were available, whether it was also through just military crackdowns where, you know, soldiers were really targeting the most intellectual professors, or whether it was just even economic uncertainty that drove many of these professors to other markets, to other environments. What that has now left is a university system that really struggles to actually develop itself internally. It relies a lot on external support, and that external support comes with a lot of conditions. And many times the conditions do not encourage you just thinking for thinking's sake. We need environments that allow thinking for thinking's sake. Whether the idea is going to yield $1 billion or not, run
Let
it,
it flow.
you know. And I feel like we've lost that, not just in Nigeria, but in many actual parts of the world. And I think we're suffering because of that. And that's why we're recycling a lot of the same thoughts. And that's also why we're producing graduates who are not necessarily encouraged or do not necessarily feel encouraged to branch out, to test new ideas.
Part of the status quo.
You know, it's just go, you know.
Market.
There's this thing that we used to say when I worked, so I did a lot of my background in consulting, right? And there was this thing that we used to say back then when we're advising or just even analyzing, let's say, the state of unemployment in Nigeria. And now when I think back on that, it's so cringe because we used to say something like, you know, the education to employment pipeline. You know, we've now come to this stage in our society where the only reason you're going to university is to be
Because
employed.
you're told that
You
that's
know,
the route to take.
and that's the route to employment.
Yeah.
don't go there to learn anything. Just
Yeah.
go there to learn those skills that will get you employed. Don't go there to question anything. Don't go there to like, try
You
and
don't
figure out
even need
anything.
to learn those skills
You
to
don't
get you
need-
employed. You just need to have the
Have the
certificate at the
degree,
end of it.
And then,
Yeah.
and then, so it's so universities have now become this, I'm sorry to go all like meta on us, but they've become this kind of like late stage capitalist factory that's just churning out the next set of workers, and we see that a lot in Nigeria where people are now having this argument of, universities are oversubscribed. What happens to places like vocational schools, where if it really is about skills and really, people are very interested and passionate in certain skills, why not just take up an apprenticeship, do all of these things? But we've now made universities the only route through which you can kind of have that kind of social mobility. But not just even that, it's a very rigid system where you have to conform to certain ideas, you have to conform to certain things so that you can get that certificate and then move on. But for me, it's very important, and I've said this to many academics in Nigeria, that universities are not just places where students are learning to respect authority. They are also places where students are learning how to question authority as well. We're not doing that other part. And what that means for like media, for example, or what that means in terms of, when we ask ourselves about good media, it's that people are just, okay, there must be a system, there must be a what's it called? There must just be this kind of expo that we can just use to get this grade and just move on. But the real world doesn't work like that. The real world requires constant iteration. It requires you exploring things, experimenting, figuring things out. You will upset some people, you will not. So it's kind of like, how well are we preparing people for that kind of environment? And so oftentimes when you then come out of that and you're in a workshop and we're telling you that, look, yes, we get that this is how it has been done and how you think this must be done, but in the reality, the rules are not that rigid, right? You still need to explore this, explore that. It almost feels like we've opened up a new door in their own imagination, and you can almost feel that, oh wow,
There's a shift.
I didn't know that, I didn't know that this was allowed. I didn't know that this was, permitted. It's like somebody that I was telling recently about what makes a good Nigerian story. And many people often think that, I want to talk about, Boko Haram, I want to do. And I'm like, sometimes what we just need is maybe a really brilliant story about plantain. And I've said this many times because I've not seen somebody do that. Just help us understand plantain. Like just this thing that we see every day that we take for granted. How is it grown? Where does it come from? Who are the people that are, in the value chain? Where did it start? Just tracing it and just being very obsessed with our own realities. And I think that we've been fed this idea that, our realities are only valid when they're extreme. But sometimes I just like, for me, it's like, I like to just, I want people to just be a bit more self-indulgent. Like, okay, people like, I don't know, they like Akara. Let me do something about that and understand the women and just go into their stories and their lives. I don't think we do that enough. And then what happens is, for some reason, maybe there's an editor in a magazine somewhere outside of Nigeria, maybe a German magazine. They fly in, they do something interesting about Puff and Akara, and everybody's like, "Oh my god,
that becomes the topic of the
and it's like this thing. You are surrounded by this thing,
for granted.
every
just
day.
wait for somebody else to do it.
And for me, like one of my favorite writers is Toni Morrison, and I'm always fond of quoting her. And I always remember that she always says, "Look, the very function of writing or writers is that you must mystify the mundane. This idea of this thing that we think we know and that we enjoy and that is just taken for granted. If you look closer at it, it may actually tell you a lot more about your realities than you think about." Our latest issue right now is on Ladi Kwali, who's on like the 20 Naira note. And for me, the biggest question is,
I didn't know that.
how many people
No.
I didn't know that.
how many people know
First
who
of all,
she is?
how do people know that we have a 20 Naira note with a woman on it?
Exactly. And she's the only woman that's known
That's
on a
interesting,
Nigerian currency. And so for me, it's like, what is her story? Where did she come from? And these are things that, of course, certain sects of Nigerians will know, like maybe art history people, those types of. But it's like, okay, why was she put on the
curious, actually.
On the Naira note? How did she become who she is? Where is the Naira note even now? Like, you don't see the 20 Naira note anymore. What does that even mean?
But there's so many things that come in and out of our lives that we don't
just
even
no
notice.
idea.
We just don't notice.
And I mean, obviously, we can't take note of every single thing that comes into our lives, but there's so many things that enter and we use on a daily basis. We don't question where does it come from.
Nothing.
Why did we start using cups, or why did we start wearing hats, or whatever it is.
Why do we have a place in our homes called boys' quarters? What does that even come from? What does that
Yeah.
even mean?
Wait.
So
onto something.
that's what I mean by just being a bit more self-indulgent. And I feel like we can learn a lot. I'm sorry to go all cliche, on us here, but we can learn a lot from Americans here because
Yeah.
they can be so self-indulgent. Something happens in America, and like in 2 weeks, somebody has already
Everyone in the world knows
somebody has already
about
produced
it.
a book.
Oh, I
And it's
swear.
like, this thing is,
Yeah.
where did you even find the time to write a book on spoons or on, or for me, it's like, pigeon is something we speak every day. Where is our pigeon dictionary? There's just so many of these things. And I understand that many of these things sometimes is also
Yeah.
due to like resources and availability of funds. But I even think before we get to that, there's a mindset shift that needs to happen where we are not just taking everything that we see for granted and not just assuming that something is only important in Nigeria when people
Others-
die as a result of it, or when it involves the president.
Yeah.
It can just, even sometimes like a road, just how a road is built and the story behind it, who had to suffer for it to be built, or who made a big gain out of it being built, can be a really powerful story.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like those stories are everywhere. They are endless. For me, it ranges from things like we talk a lot about how we have this sugar St. Louis that doesn't do any adverts. Where does it come from? We all consume this thing. We've all known this
Yeah.
thing. And I just feel like there are these things that are there in our everyday life that make our country function, whether we like it or not. That if they were to disappear today, we would actually notice. But just because they're there and they're just so like ubiquitous, we just think that, oh, okay, it's like air, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, how do we get more people obsessed about
More
their
demanding,
realities?
yeah.
So when I'm in rooms with young people like that, when I'm in, workshops, for me, I'm telling them that, yeah, I get that you want to tell that story about this governor or whatever. Maybe let's walk up your,
Yeah.
your
I
credibility
think-
to that level. But for now, the story
Yeah.
that you can actually tell a really powerful story about the things that are just around you. And
and things that you don't even notice regularly. But I hope that actually gets people thinking about every little thing they touched today after listening to this podcast.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much, Wale.
Absolutely.
it has been such a pleasure having
Pleasure.
you
Thank you
here.
so much.
So
And
interesting.
you've
Like my brain
is like
cells are so active.
yeah, like I can't wait to read the story.
absolutely,
Your
you must.
magazine comes out quarterly,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And where can people pick it up?
So this can be bought in most bookstores in Lagos, Roving Heights, Strawberry Cafe, Glendora. It's all across Lagos. We also have retailers in Abuja as well. In fact, if you go on our website, we have a store locator.
Okay, perfect.
It's literally in the footer of the website, and it's republic.com, rpublc.com. And there you can just put in an address or a city, and then you can find it. And then for your listeners who are not in Nigeria, we are nationwide across the US with Barnes & Noble. And we
amazing.
are also in
Congratulations.
several European cities, including the UK, London, Amsterdam, Belgium.
So there's no excuse. You
Lisbon.
can access it.
You can access the
Online
Republic,
also?
Online.
Fantastic.
Online as well, republic.com, and also in print and physically.
Amazing. Wale, thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.
So much. Wow.
And look forward to more conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. This was really awesome. Thank you.